June 17th, 1786, 20,000 Bostonians celebrated Bunker Hill Day. That is the 11th anniversary of the cataclysmic battle at Bunker Hill in Charlestown across Boston Harbor by doing something extraordinary. They walked across a bridge from Boston to Charlestown. Now, this may not sound like such a great feat. You know, people walk across bridges all the time. But the Charles River Bridge, as it was called, was the furthest north bridge anyone had ever tried to build over tidal water. Boston Harbor has 11-foot tides twice a day. The Charles River, which flows into the harbor here, can freeze, and ice, of course, is going to dam it and knock bridges down quite easily. But a group of investors and a brilliant engineer named Lemuel Cox had designed a bridge to cross the Charles River where it joins Boston Harbor. Extraordinary feat. The members of the state legislature actually walked across the bridge for free. Everyone else paid the toll because the bridge was a private enterprise. The Charles River Bridge proprietors have been given a charter by the legislature to build the bridge, and this is the way public works would be done. The legislature, on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth, would grant a charter to a certain entity to do something, and that entity would do it, and they would pay a small share to the granting agency. Similar to the Massachusetts Bay Company, they had been given a charter by the King of England to trade in Massachusetts Bay. You know, and other corporations are started in this same way. The state is not in the business of building roads or bridges itself. Instead, it gives someone else a charter or a contract to do this, and then that person does it, and then that person, in the case of the Charles River Bridge proprietors, can collect a toll. It's a way of compensating them for the risk they have taken in building a bridge or building a road. Bridges, ferries, etc. are considered public utilities, and as such, the sovereign power grants someone the power to operate, the right to operate them, but they do this in the public interest. I should point out that before there was a bridge, there was a ferry operated between Boston and Charlestown, and the ferry actually had been operated since 1650 by Harvard College. Now, the college over in Cambridge, they had a vested interest, or an interest in having some way of transiting between Cambridge and Boston, and having a ferry over the Charles River in Charlestown was a very convenient way to do this. So after about 1650, Harvard had the right to run a ferry, and then, of course, when the legislature in the 1780s is considering whether to grant this group of proprietors the power to build a bridge, or the ability to build a bridge, the question comes up, well, what about Harvard's ferry? And so what the legislature did was require the proprietors of the bridge to pay an annuity, an annual sum, to Harvard to compensate Harvard for the loss of the revenues Harvard had enjoyed from the ferry. So every year the Charles River Bridge Company would pay Harvard about £200 a year, or $666 a year. And it's difficult to make an exact translation between dollar figures from the 1780s and today, because there are different ways of measuring worth. Actually, you can go to a website, www.measuringworth.com, and do the different kinds of calculations about how much $666 in 1787 would be worth today. Anyway, that's the state of things. 1786, the proprietors of the Charles River Bridge successfully build their toll bridge, and the legislature says that, okay, for 40 years you can collect a toll, and after 40 years, quite likely, you will have been paid back for your investment plus some. 1792, now that we see that a bridge can be built over the Charles River, the legislature grants a charter to another group to build a bridge. This one can't be close to the Charles River Bridge. It's actually going to be a bit west of the Charles River Bridge, and this one is going to be going between Boston and Cambridge in the western part of Boston, or the bridge is in the western part of Boston. And couple of things about this. One, because the Charles River Bridge is going to suffer a bit, the legislature extends to 70 years the period of time in which the Charles River Bridge can collect tolls. So instead of stopping collecting tolls in 1837, they can collect tolls until 1877 because 1857. So the Charles River Bridge is going to suffer, but they can collect tolls for a longer time. And the new bridge will pay Harvard £300. And so now we have two bridges across the Charles River, half in the early 1790s. Combined, they're paying Harvard about $1,200 a year. Now, it turns out the Charles River Bridge was a very good investment. The proprietors had raised funds by selling stock, and that's the way a corporation raises money, by selling stock. And you as a proprietor could buy stock in the corporation too. In 1786, a share of stock in the Charles River Bridge was worth about $333. That's how much you would buy one for if you wanted to invest in the Charles River Bridge. It's a risk you're taking. They might not be able to build the bridge. First freeze might wash it out. High tide might wash it out. But the bridge is successful. So by 1805, a share of stock in the Charles River Bridge is selling for about $1,600. And 2 years later, Harvard buys 2 shares of stock for $2,000 each. And between 1786 and 1827, the Charles River Bridge, and that's the 40-year period in which the bridge would have been collecting tolls, the bridge earns about $825,000. Phenomenal. That's the toll revenue from the bridge, or about $20,000 a year. Very safe investment, actually a very lucrative investment. If you had $300 back in 1786 to put it in the Charles River Bridge, and you would have gotten quite a nice annuity over the next 40 years. And remember, in the early 1790s, the legislature had said, you know what, you can collect tolls for the next 30 years because we're building this other bridge. Now, one reason the bridge is so profitable, of course, is because Boston's population is growing quite exponentially in the first and middle decades of the 19th century. There were about 40,000 people in Boston in 1810, more than 50,000 in 1820, 90,000 in 1830, and then there's going to be a real boom in the 1830s and 40s. And as the population increases, the population in the surrounding hinterland also increases, and people push for more or easier access into the city of Boston. Boston became a city in the early 1820s. And in 1827, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act to build a new bridge, or allow a new bridge to be built from Charlestown to Boston. The governor of Massachusetts, Levi Lincoln, vetoed this. 2 reasons. One, the state, by passing a law to allow a new bridge to be built, was actually destroying the value of the old Charles River Bridge Corporation. So the state had chartered this corporation, and then by passing the new law, it was going to be, or allowing a new bridge to be built, it was actually going to be limiting the value of that corporation, or impairing the obligation of the contract, which the Constitution says a state cannot do. And certainly Lincoln was aware of the Fletcher versus Peck case and of the Dartmouth College case, so he knew how the Supreme Court came down on states impairing obligation of contracts. And also, Lincoln wondered if the state could regard the interests of its current citizens, and that certainly is a primary interest of the state, as being less important than the interests of the original holder, the charter of the Charles River Bridge Corporation. Can the state say, what's in the best interest of these people who voted for us is actually more important than what was in our interest back when we granted the charter? So that's one of the problems. And Lincoln is also aware of one of the other underlying issues here, which is technology is rapidly changing the value of things like bridges and turnpikes. Just a couple of years earlier, actually, around this time, Massachusetts, or someone in Massachusetts, is building the first railroad to convey granite from quarries in Quincy, south of Boston, to barges to take the granite up to Charlestown, actually, to build the Bunker Hill Monument. So we have this technological innovation going on in steam technology. So things are changing. The bridge, nonetheless. Remember, the legislature passes a law to allow a new bridge to be built. The governor vetoes it. And in 1828, the legislature again charters a bridge over the river. This new bridge, which will be called the Warren Bridge, would be allowed to collect tolls only until they had collected the cost of construction plus 5%, or for 6 years. Members of the legislature saying, well, wait a minute, how come we gave the proprietors of the Charles River Bridge this 70-year deal during which time they could collect tolls? Wouldn't it be more reasonable simply to say you can collect tolls until you've made your money back plus 5%? 5% is not an insignificant return on an investment, or for 6 years. And the new bridge, recognizing that it was going to destroy the value, some of the value of the old bridge, would pay Harvard about half of the annual annuity due Harvard. The Massachusetts legislature is very careful to look out for the interests of Harvard College, or now Harvard University, in this. Also, the proprietors, the folks who are promoting the new bridge, plan to build it quite close to the Charles River Bridge. In fact, their entrance roads would pass about 26 feet away from each other on either side of the river. And the entrance to the river in Boston would be about 900 feet from the entrance to the Charles River Bridge, and in Charlestown the entrance to the bridges would be about 200 feet apart. So they're quite close together. Now remember, after 6 years, the new bridge isn't going to have a toll. So you have a choice. You can walk an extra 900 feet or take your car an extra 900 feet and go for free, or you can pay a toll to the Charles River Bridge. The state isn't telling you what choice to make. The proprietors aren't telling you what choice to make, but the choice is there. Now, the new bridge will be named for Joseph Warren, hero of Bunker Hill. So the Warren Bridge is going to open quite close to the Charles River Bridge, and the Charles River Bridge proprietors are not happy one bit about this development. So they go to court. They seek an injunction to prevent the building of the new bridge. They fail, that is, they sue. They fail to get an injunction, then they sue. The Charles River Bridge Corporation sues the Warren Bridge Corporation for building a new bridge that is going to destroy the value of the old bridge. They argue that the state is actually taking away the vested rights of the Charles River Bridge Corporation by allowing this new bridge to be built, which will destroy the value of the old bridge. Now, this case, late 1820s, early 1830s, comes at a time of changing ideas about the role of corporations and the nature of corporate power, corporate rights. Remember, Roger Taney, the Attorney General in the Jackson administration, had written Jackson's veto message on the bank, and he argued that corporations are created to serve the public, or for the benefit of the public. That is, they're granted certain privileges in return for serving the public. And these privileges are not for the benefit of corporations, but in fact are for the broader interest of the public. And in general, the Jacksonian policy is one of laissez-faire. The state shouldn't be interfering in the marketplace and should allow private enterprise to act for the public good. And the Warren Bridge is an example of this. Private entrepreneurs getting together and saying, hey, it would be the benefit of the public to build this bridge, and we'll collect just enough to make back our investment plus 5%. The builders will benefit from this. Society will benefit from this. Everyone is happy, except, of course, those proprietors of the Charles River Bridge. And, by the way, they've already made a bundle, so why should they be complaining about this? The old monopoly. And remember, the spirit of the times is very much against monopolies. Now, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court is divided on this when it hears the case, and Isaac Parker, the Chief Justice, says that the new bridge actually does violate the Constitution's stricture against impairing the obligations of contracts. And he said, had the Warren Bridge been chartered in 1787, everyone would have recognized the grave injustice of it. Now, the Charles River Bridge has made this huge profit. People are less sympathetic. They don't remember the risk the proprietors took back in 1787 in building that bridge, so no one really cares about the problems of the hardships of the Charles River Bridge Corporation. Marcus Morton, also on the Supreme Court, who had been Democratic governor he had been a candidate for governor, the Democrats' candidate for governor, virtually every year between 1828 and 1843. Every year there's an election for governor. Morton had run every year as the Democratic candidate, lost every year, but 1839, he finds the new bridge perfectly all right and constitutional. If it's not constitutional to allow the Warren Bridge to be built, then there can be no improvement, no new bridge, no canal, no railroad constitutionally established. For in the present state of our country, no such improved channel of communication can be opened without diminishing the profits of some old corporation. You know, we have new technology, railroads, telegraphs, which are going to put out of business other enterprises. If the state can't grant charters to these new enterprises, then we're not going to have any new enterprises. We'll simply be relegated to relying on the old technology. There's also, in addition to this constitutional issue, there's an economic issue of creative destruction. Sometimes an old company does have to be destroyed in order to put capital into something else. If you keep propping up existing structures in the Charles River Bridge because you don't want to hurt the proprietors, then you're not putting that capital into something else. So the principle of economic destruction, and for Marcus Morton, the idea of allowing new enterprises to flourish, sometimes that means the old enterprise has to give way. Now, initially in 1831, this case of Warren Bridge versus Charles River Bridge, or Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge, goes to the United States Supreme Court. Daniel Webster acted as chief counsel for the Charles River Bridge, saying that the state cannot impair the obligation of its contract. William Wirt, former Attorney General of the United States, was the counsel for the Warren Bridge, and Wirt and Warren argue the case, but the Supreme Court couldn't decide it. They put it aside. In 1837, the case comes back to the court. Now, things have changed quite a bit since 1831. Number one, Chief Justice Warren is dead. Chief Justice Marshall was dead. Marshall, of course, had articulated the case, the Dartmouth College case, the Fletcher versus Peck case, saying states cannot impair the obligation of contracts. And it's probably clear which way Marshall would have ruled in this case. Joseph Story, who was also on the court, will find for the Charles River Bridge, and it's quite likely that's the way that Marshall would have ruled had he been on the court, but Marshall is not. Marshall had been succeeded as Chief Justice by Roger Taney. Remember, the author of the Jackson's veto message. Jackson, in fact, had tried to appoint Taney to be an associate justice in 1834, but the Senate had rejected the nomination because they were still sore with Taney for the bank message and for stripping the bank in the whole bank war in Broglio. But then when Marshall died, Jackson had an opportunity, and the Senate had changed enough that he could appoint Taney to be Chief Justice. The senators who had blocked Taney in 1834 probably wished they had held off. Otherwise, better to have Taney as Associate Justice than as Chief Justice. Someone wrote that the pure ermine of the Supreme Court is sullied by the appointment of that political hack. That is, Taney was a political hack. Certainly not. No one had the stature of John Marshall, but on the other hand, when Marshall had been appointed, he also was a politician, senator from Virginia, Secretary of State. Taney had been Attorney General of Maryland, then Attorney General of the United States. He had been acting Secretary of the Treasury, but the Senate had rejected his confirmation. Also at this time, William Wirt has gone to his great reward. Once again, Daniel Webster argues the case for the Charles River Bridge. And the Warren Bridge is represented by very distinguished counsel, Simon Greenleaf, a professor of law at Harvard University, John Davis, who is a senator from Massachusetts. And while Greenleaf is off in Washington arguing the case of the Warren Bridge, Charles Sumner, an aspiring young lawyer from Boston, teaches Greenleaf's classes at Harvard. And Joseph Story is quite impressed by this display of Harvard's legal acumen in the Charles River Bridge case. 4 of her leading men brought out in the same cause, none of them inferior to those who are accustomed to lead here. You have the leading lights of the Boston Bar here in Washington arguing the case of the Warren Bridge versus the Charles River Bridge. Now, this time, too, the Warren Bridge is no longer charging tolls. It's 6 years have gone by since it was built. The proprietors no longer charge tolls. The state actually had kept the tolls in place. They'd allowed the bridge to keep charging tolls as long as there was a threat that they might lose the case, but now they've suspended the tolls. So you have a free bridge operating next to the toll bridge, and guess what? No one wants to go across the toll bridge. So the Charles River Bridge has shut down. The proprietors can't collect tolls. They're not going to let you cross the bridge. The stock was worthless. If you had bought stock earlier, you should have sold it before this point because now it's worth 0. And Harvard is no longer getting its annuity here. Now, in 1837, Chief Justice Taney issued the opinion of the Supreme Court in the case. And the court came down on the side of the Warren Bridge. The Warren Bridge does not actually impair the contract the state made with the Charles River Bridge back in 1787. It does not interrupt passage over the Charles River Bridge, nor make the way to it more or less convenient. None of the faculties or franchises granted to the Charles River Bridge Corporation have been revoked by the legislature, and its right to take the tolls granted by the charter remain unaltered. The state doesn't say anything about whether you can or cannot pay a toll on the bridge. All its franchise rights are unimpaired, but its income is destroyed. The legislature, however, had not contracted with the proprietors of the bridge, saying we won't limit tolls or we won't build another bridge. These things were only there by implication. And remember, Taney comes from out of the tradition of Thomas Jefferson in wanting strict construction of something and not implication or implying that something might be there. The whole community are interested in this inquiry, Taney said, and they have a right to require that the power of promoting their comfort and convenience and of advancing public prosperity by providing safe, convenient, cheap ways of transportation of produce and the purposes of travel shall not be construed to have been surrendered or diminished by the state. Some corporations have been ruined by new technologies. Railroads have obliterated turnpikes. Back at the turn of the century, states were chartering in groups of investors to build turnpikes, and some of them still remain, actually. Many turnpikes, you can look to see whether a turnpike near you was built during this period, or a road near you, since many are no longer charging tolls. So now railroads in the 1830s are putting the turnpikes out of business, and yet the state had given someone a charter to build a turnpike and charge tolls, and then the state gave someone a charter to build a railroad. States also had given individual or groups of investors, a charter to build canals, and all of these were in competition. We shall be thrown back to the improvements of the last century and obliged to stand still until the claims of the old turnpike corporations shall be satisfied, and they shall consent to permit these states to avail themselves of the lights of modern science. Can the court decide that when a turnpike runs from one town to another, no canal can run there or no railroad can run there? Essentially, had the court found for the Charles River Bridge, we would be walking on turnpikes, essentially. And this parallels Morton's Morton's argument in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, freeing corporations. It also, however, puts a rather significant limit on corporate charters because the states can actually modify the charter by doing something like this. It's an assertion of state power, that is, the state maintains the sovereign power to decide what is good for most people, even if it means upsetting the interests of a few. It's the utilitarian principle of Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good for the greatest number here. And Justice Story, as I said, dissented in this case, saying that at the time the charter had been granted to the Charles River Bridge, the Constitution of the United States was not only not in existence, it was not even dreamed of. The Union of the States was crumbling into ruins under the old Confederation. Agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce were at their lowest ebb, infinite danger to the states. And during this time of great uncertainty, these investors had very boldly decided to build this bridge. And the grantor of the and so when the meaning of a grant is clear, Story said, and remember, Story was also a professor of law at Harvard College and one of the great legal minds the country has ever produced, said when a meaning of the grant is clear, it's usually construed against the grantor, in this case the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the Commonwealth cannot limit a charter it is granted. Now, Tawney is looking ahead to economic progress. Well, so is Story. I mean, if you're thinking about investing in something, are you going to invest if the state then can limit your investment later on and say, hey, you know what, we're going to do something else that's going to limit the investment you have just made? You know, you don't want your investment to be made worthless by subsequent state action. Now, broadly speaking, we can see in this a real difference between Story, Webster, the Whigs, and their idea of having a charter, a written charter, limiting what the state can do, and then Jackson, Tawney, and so on, seeing a more expansive role for states, and also wanting to liberate the marketplace from the dead hand of the past. So, Charles River Bridge, too bad, the Warren Bridge is constitutional. In 1841, the Massachusetts legislature paid off the proprietors of the Charles River Bridge. They paid them $25,000. Much less than the bridge had been earning. They reopened the bridge, and also they reinstate tolls on the Warren Bridge, because of course they're charging tolls on the Charles River Bridge. You know, the House never loses when it's the state. In 1843, they removed the tolls. They paid the state they paid Harvard a lump sum, and then in the 1880s, the Charles River Bridge was transferred. The title of it was transferred to the city of Boston. Ultimately, Boston replaces the Charles River Bridge. We get into an era after the Civil War when the state actually is building these amenities, and then the Warren Bridge ultimately was replaced by an elevated railroad line, plus there was a vehicle bridge over it. And now the Warren Bridge remains. The elevated train line is gone. Where the Charles River Bridge used to run, there now is a very elegant bridge where the Interstate 93 crosses the Charles River, and none of these improvements would have been possible. An elevated train line, the Leonard Zachem Bridge, had the Supreme Court ruled that the Charles River Bridge contract prevented anyone else from building a bridge across the Charles River.